Coin Echo Death Good evening, and welcome back to Warm Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I want to start by thanking you from the heart. Your support and presence here make this journey truly special. Preparing these mysteries is a labor of love, and it's so rewarding to see how many of you find comfort and delight in them. Our cozy community keeps growing, and that's thanks to you. If you'd like to help us share even more timeless stories, please remember to subscribe. Now let's settle in and drift together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Wishing Well at Dusk. The late August afternoon hung golden and drowsy over St. Mary Me, that most English of villages, where nothing of consequence ever seemed to happen, and yet where Miss Jane Marple had learned that human nature revealed itself in the smallest of domestic dramas. The annual harvest fete had been pronounced a great success by all concerned. The church roof fund, that perpetual concern of rural parishes everywhere, had been swelled by a gratifying amount. Now, as the sun dropped lower and cast long shadows across the village green, the last stragglers were packing away the remnants of bunting and folding trestle tables with the satisfied air of those who have done their duty and may now look forward to a well-earned pot of tea. Miss Marple, having contributed a considerable quantity of knitted items to the handicraft stall, and having purchased back several of them at what she privately considered rather inflated prices, stood by the lych gate and surveyed the scene with those deceptively mild blue eyes that saw rather more than most people suspected. The old stone wishing well dominated the green. It had stood there for centuries, a relic of some medieval piety now pressed into service for more worldly purposes. Today it wore a garland of late summer flowers and a carefully painted placard that read in cheerful letters, "Wishes, 1 penny for the church roof." The well had been the centerpiece of the fete, and throughout the day a steady stream of villagers and visitors had dropped their pennies through the gap in the heavy wooden lid, making their wishes with varying degrees of seriousness. The custom, as Miss Marple well knew, was to leave the day's collection overnight. It was considered traditional, even lucky. The coins would be hoisted up at 9 o'clock the following morning, counted with ceremony, and added to the fund. The arrangement had worked perfectly well for as long as anyone could remember. Mr. Amos Dilling, the parish treasurer, had been hovering near the well for most of the afternoon. His narrow face wore that expression of pinched vigilance that Miss Marple had long ago identified as characteristic of those who count every farthing and resent every halfpenny that passes through other hands. He was not, she reflected, a popular man. There had been certain whispers about expenses claimed, small discrepancies that were never quite explained, but nothing one could actually put one's finger on. Nothing, that is, that would stand up in a court of law, though in the court of village opinion, Mr. Dilling had been tried and found somewhat wanting. Jacob Reeve, the well warden, was securing the padlock with his usual deliberate care. He was a stooped man of perhaps 60, with the patient, weathered face of one who has spent his life in honest labor. The position of well warden was hereditary in his family, or as near to hereditary as made no difference. His father and grandfather before him had tended the well, kept the windlass greased, the bucket rope sound, and the stonework in good repair. Miss Lily Pratt, the village schoolmistress, was folding away the striped cloth from her booth. She was a woman of perhaps 35, bright-eyed and energetic, with that particular air of competent cheerfulness that marks the good teacher. She had managed the wishing well booth throughout the day with admirable efficiency, encouraging the children to make their wishes, and ensuring that every penny was dropped properly. Ned Booker, the carter, lumbered past with a collection of folding chairs balanced on his broad shoulders. He was a burly man with hands like hams and a perpetual expression of resentful suspicion. Miss Marple had heard that Mr. Dilling had threatened to report him for drawing water from the well after hours for his cattle, something that was technically not permitted but which had been tolerated for years until Dilling took it upon himself to enforce the regulations. Mr. Paul Hart, who had recently moved to a cottage on the edge of the village, and who described himself as a numismatist, was helping Miss Pratt sort through a collection of small change. He was a smooth-faced man of 40 or so, with the kind of pleasant, cultivated manner that could belong to a gentleman, or to someone who had learned to imitate one. Miss Marple, who had seen both varieties in her time, reserved judgment. Lady Bantry, dear Dolly, came bustling over with that expression of pleasant exhaustion that follows a successful charitable endeavor. She'd been in charge of the cake stall, and her hands were still faintly dusted with icing sugar. "Well, Jane, I think we may consider that a triumph," she declared. "The well alone must have collected pounds. Such a clever idea, really. Do you remember when we were girls how we used to drop pins and listen for the echo when they hit the water?" "Indeed I do," Miss Marple replied, "though I believe there was a metal plate of some kind that made the sound. A ringer plate, I think they called it." "Quite right. Jacob took it down this morning. He said health and safety or some such nonsense. Still, the well served its purpose beautifully." The Reverend Leonard Clement appeared, his vague scholarly face bearing that expression of mild bewilderment that seemed to be his habitual response to parish activities. His wife Griselda, some 20 years his junior and possessed of considerably more practical sense, was directing the final stages of the clearing up with brisk efficiency. As the church clock struck the 8:15, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Dilling returning to the green. He walked with his characteristic fussy gait, casting glances to left and right, as though suspecting that someone might be planning to make off with church property. He approached the well and stood looking at it for a moment, then glanced around rather furtively before moving closer. Jacob Reeve, who was loading his gardening tools into a handcart, called out, "All locked up proper. Mr. Dilling, you needn't worry yourself." Dilling waved a dismissive hand. "Just making certain the placard is secure. Can't be too careful." Miss Marple, who was walking slowly homeward, paused to adjust her glove. From long experience she had learned that this simple action allowed one to observe a great deal without appearing to do so. The evening was drawing in now, the golden light fading to amber. The village green, so busy an hour ago, was nearly deserted. A thin mist was beginning to rise from the duck pond at the far end of the green. Then, cutting through the peaceful evening air, came a sound that made Miss Marple's blood run cold. It was a cry, thin, sharp, and dreadful. It seemed to come from the direction of the well. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from various cottages and gardens, people began to run toward the green. Miss Marple, despite her years, moved with surprising speed. By the time she reached the well, a small crowd had gathered. Jacob Reeve was there, his face gray with shock. Dr. Haydock, who had been passing on his evening rounds, was kneeling by the well's edge. The heavy wooden lid stood half open. The padlock hung loose, the key still in it. And there, caught in the throat of the well, held by the rim of the heavy wooden bucket, was the body of Amos Dilling. His narrow face was turned upward, water streaming from his clothes. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky. Dr. Haydock looked up grimly. "Dead," he said quietly. "Head struck hard by something, then drowned. Must have fallen while trying to open the well." Inspector Slack, who had arrived with remarkable promptness, looked down at the body with an expression of grim satisfaction. Fell, did he? Or was he reaching in for the takings? Greedy men fall in more ways than one, but Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the windlass mechanism, and on something that glinted in the last rays of the sun. A penny lying on the stone coping. A penny with what looked like a small notch filed into its edge. Chapter 2. A Coin and a Cry. The body had been removed by the time full darkness fell, but the well remained cordoned off with a length of rope that Dr. Haydock had produced from his motor car. A constable stood guard, looking cold and rather miserable in the evening damp, while Inspector Slack conducted his preliminary investigations with that air of aggressive efficiency that Miss Marple had long since recognized as concealing a certain lack of imagination. The small crowd that had gathered at the discovery had now dispersed to their various homes, though Miss Marple suspected that in every cottage and parlor the same conversations were taking place. Death in a village was never a private matter, particularly when it came suddenly and in circumstances that seemed to invite speculation. She herself had retired to the vicarage drawing-room at Griselda Clement's insistence. Dear Griselda had a kind heart, even if she did sometimes speak before thinking, and she had pronounced firmly that Miss Marple should not walk home alone after such a shock. The Reverend Clement had nodded vaguely, his mind clearly on the funeral arrangements that would need to be made, while Dr. Haydock had accepted a whiskey and looked thoughtful. Inspector Slack arrived at 9, his notebook in hand, and his expression suggesting that he considered the matter largely settled. He had that dangerous combination of certainty and laziness that Miss Marple had observed in those who prefer simple solutions to complex truths. "Well, it's clear enough what happened," he announced, settling himself in the best chair without waiting to be invited. Dilling went back to the well after it was locked up. Had his own key to the padlock, being treasurer. Thought he'd have a peek at the takings. Maybe help himself to a bit extra. Leaned over too far. The windlass handle caught him a crack on the head, and down he went. Greed and carelessness, plain and simple. "But Jacob Reeves says he locked the well himself at 7, Griselda protested. "He says only he and Mr. Dilling had keys." "Exactly so, Mrs. Clement. Dilling let himself in, didn't he?" "For what purpose, I ask you, except to meddle with the money?" Dr. Haydock set down his glass with a decisive click. "The timing troubles me, Slack. I examined the body at 25 minutes past 8. Rigor hadn't begun. Body temperature and other signs suggested death had occurred no more than 10 to 15 minutes prior. That would place the actual event somewhere between 8:10 and 8:15. "There you are, then," Slack said triumphantly. "Fits perfectly. Reeve locked up at 7. Dilling came back at 8 or thereabouts, let himself in, had his accident, and Bob's your uncle." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly with her knitting, looked up. "I wonder," she said in her gentle voice, "whether anyone else saw Mr. Dilling return to the well." Slack consulted his notebook. Miss Lily Pratt mentioned seeing him. Spoke to her, he did, as she was packing up her booth. Said something about making certain the placard was properly fixed. That was just after dusk, she thinks. "How very conscientious of him," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I confess I had not thought Mr. Dilling particularly concerned with placards." "Guilty conscience, more like," Slack said darkly. "Needed an excuse to go back." "And Mr. Ned Booker," Miss Marple continued, still knitting placidly. "He was rather vocal this evening about Mr. Dilling's threats regarding the water. I understand there had been words between them." Slack waved this aside. "Booker's got a temper, I'll grant you, but he was seen at the Hare and Hounds from 9 onward. Besides, the well was locked. You can't murder a man through a padlocked lid now, can you?" "There is also Mr. Paul Hart," Miss Marple observed. "Such a helpful gentleman. I noticed him assisting Miss Pratt with the counting earlier." "Hart?" Dr. Haydock frowned. "The coin collector fellow. What's his involvement?" "He was helping sort the morning's collection," Griselda supplied. "I saw them together around 6. He seemed very interested in examining each coin carefully. Said he was looking for anything unusual." "Collectors are like that, I suppose." Slack made a note, though his expression suggested he found this line of inquiry unpromising. "I'll speak to him, but I don't see where you're going with this, Miss Marple. Man had an accident. Pure and simple." It was at this moment that young Tom Petta was shown in, cap in hand, and clearly bursting with importance. Tom was perhaps 14, a bright-eyed boy who helped with odd jobs about the village and who possessed that unfortunate combination of sharp observation and imperfect judgment that marks the unreliable witness. "Begging your pardon, Inspector," he began, "but I thought I ought to tell you what I heard." Slack looked up with interest. "Well, lad, speak up." "It was when I was cycling home, sir. I'd been to my gran's in Lower Meadow, and I came past the green on my way back. I looked at my watch particularly because Gran had said I was to be home by 10 and not a minute later. It was 10:05 exactly, sir. And as I went by the well, I heard it, clear as day." "Heard what?" Slack demanded. "A coin dropping, sir. A ping, like, and then a splash. Just like when folks were making their wishes during the day." "Ping, and then splash." There was a moment of silence. Dr. Haydock sat forward sharply. 10:05? "Are you quite certain of the time, boy?" 10:05, sir, on my watch. My dad gave it to me for my birthday, and it keeps perfect time. He checked it himself against the church clock just yesterday." Slack's expression had changed from satisfaction to confusion. "But that's impossible. Dr. Haydock here says the man died around 8:15, 2 hours earlier." "I know what I heard, sir," Tom said stubbornly. "Ping and splash, clear as anything." After Tom had been sent off with instructions to say nothing to anyone, Slack sat staring at his notebook as though willing it to make sense of itself. "There's your answer," Dr. Haydock said quietly. "The boy heard a coin drop at 5:10. Dilling must have still been alive then. My initial assessment must have been wrong. But you said—" "I know what I said, Slack, but I'm not infallible. The temperature of the water, the evening air, various factors could have affected my judgment. If the boy heard a coin drop at 5:10, then Dilling was alive to drop it." Slack seized on this gratefully. "There you are, then. Dilling was at the well at 5:10, not at 8. Must have been there later than anyone thought, counting the takings, got greedy, leaned too far over, case closed." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "I wonder," she said, "about the sound young Tom heard. You see, dear Lady Bantry mentioned something this afternoon that struck me as rather interesting. She spoke of dropping pins in the well when we were girls and hearing them hit what she called a ringer plate, a metal disc, you know, that made a pleasant sound when objects struck it." "What of it?" Slack said impatiently. "Only that Jacob Reeve removed the ringer plate this morning for safety reasons," he said. "So if there was no ringer plate in the well, what made that particular pinging sound? Water alone would give more of a plop, wouldn't it? Particularly at this time of year when the water level is relatively high after the summer rains." Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. "By Jove, she's right. The sound would be quite different." "Perhaps the boy was mistaken," Slack suggested, though without conviction. "Tom Petta has very good hearing," Miss Marple said mildly. "He won the nature sounds competition at the school last spring. He could identify 40 different birds by their calls. I don't think he would mistake a ping for a plop." Griselda's eyes were wide. "But what does it mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting and looking at the inspector with those deceptively mild blue eyes, "that we may be dealing with something rather more complicated than a simple accident. It means, I think, that someone wished us to believe that Mr. Dilling was alive at 5:10 when, in fact, he died, as Dr. Haydock originally stated, at approximately 8:15. The question we must ask ourselves is why anyone would wish to create such a deception, and how they accomplished it." Slack's face had gone from confusion to suspicious interest. "Are you saying this was murder?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, picking up her knitting once more, "that when one hears a ping where there should be a plop, one ought to investigate the circumstances most carefully. Now, Inspector, I think you will find it useful to examine the well rather thoroughly in the morning light. There may be traces of something that made that sound. And perhaps you might also inquire who was seen near the green at 5:10. She smiled gently. After all, if someone was creating a false echo, they would have needed to be somewhere nearby to do so. Chapter 3, Miss Marple Notices a Notched Penny. The morning dawned clear and bright with that particular quality of light that follows a misty evening. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and after a breakfast of toast and marmalade, had made her way to the village green with a basket over her arm. To the casual observer, she was simply an elderly lady taking a morning constitutional, perhaps intending to call on one of her neighbors. Only those who knew her well might have noticed the particular sharpness of her gaze as she approached the cordoned area around the well. Inspector Slack was already there, along with Constable Polk and Dr. Haydock. They had the wooden lid fully raised now, and Slack was peering down into the well's depths with an expression of determined concentration. "Good morning, gentlemen," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I wondered whether you had discovered anything of interest." Slack straightened up, clearly torn between irritation at her presence and a grudging respect for her observations of the previous evening. "Nothing yet, Miss Marple, though I'll admit that business about the ping has me puzzled. Can't see anything unusual down there." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we might examine the mechanism itself, the windlass and the ratchet, you know. Sometimes the most revealing clues are not hidden away at all, but simply overlooked because they seem so ordinary." She moved closer to the well's edge, and her eyes fell upon the penny that still lay on the stone coping where she had noticed it the previous evening. With a delicate movement, she picked it up and turned it over in her gloved fingers. "How curious," she murmured. Dr. Haydock looked over her shoulder. "What is it?" "This penny has been deliberately notched. See here, along the edge, someone has filed a small groove into it." She held it closer to her face, then sniffed delicately. "Boot blacking, I believe. Just the faintest trace on the notched portion." Slack took the penny from her and examined it with considerably less delicacy. "Why would anyone put blacking on a penny?" "An excellent question, Inspector. Perhaps if we examine the windlass mechanism, we might find an answer." The windlass was a simple affair, as such things generally are: a wooden drum wound with rope, a handle for turning, and a ratchet mechanism with a pawl to prevent the drum from spinning backwards once weight was applied at... Was this ratchet that now drew Miss Marple's particular attention. "Mr. Reeve," she called across the green, where Jacob was standing at a respectful distance, clearly torn between his duty as well warden and his reluctance to approach the scene of the tragedy. "Would you be so kind as to demonstrate how the ratchet functions?" Jacob approached slowly, his weathered face troubled. "It's simple enough, Miss Marple. The pal here drops into the teeth of the wheel. See? Keeps the drum from running free when there's weight in the bucket. If you want to lower the bucket, you lift the pawl up, like so," he demonstrated, lifting the small metal catch that held the ratchet in place. As he did so, Miss Marple leaned closer. "One moment, please. Mr. Reeve, don't move just yet. There." On the nose of the pal was a small smear of dark substance. Miss Marple produced a clean handkerchief from her bag and gently touched it to the smear. When she drew it away, a faint mark of black showed on the white linen. "Boot blacking again," she said quietly. "How very interesting." She turned her attention to the ratchet teeth themselves. The brass wheel was generally well polished, as one might expect from a conscientious custodian like Jacob Reeve, but one particular tooth showed something unusual. Where the others were uniformly bright, this one bore a faint smear of blackening worked into its corner, and beside it, a small, bright scratch that suggested recent impact. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, "I wonder if you would be good enough to hold this penny for me. Hold it on edge, if you please, with the notched portion facing downward." Slack did as he was asked, looking mystified. Now, if you would place it carefully between two of the ratchet teeth, yes, just there where the blackening is visible, the penny, held on edge with its notched portion downward, slipped neatly into the gap between two teeth. The notch caught against the metal, and the coin held firm. "Good gracious," Dr. Haydock breathed. "It wedges perfectly," Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed it does. And if one were to smear boot blacking on the notched edge, it would hold even more securely, would it not? The friction of the blacking against the metal tooth would prevent slipping, but it would also leave traces, a smear on the tooth where it was wedged, and another on the pawl when someone lifted it." "But why?" Slack demanded. "What would be the point of wedging a penny in the ratchet?" "Let me show you," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Reeve, if you would be so kind as to wind the handle until the drum is nearly balanced. That is, until the weight of the bucket is just barely held by the ratchet." Jacob, looking increasingly disturbed, did as she asked. The windlass creaked slightly as the drum turned. "Now," Miss Marple said, "imagine that someone wedged this penny into the ratchet tooth, holding the drum one notch past its natural balance point. The pawl would rest against the penny rather than dropping fully into the tooth. The entire mechanism would be held in a state of tension, with the handle wanting very much to fly backwards." She paused, letting the implication settle, and then she continued softly. "Imagine Mr. Dilling arriving at the well after dark. He has his key. He unlocks the padlock and lifts the lid just slightly. He leans over, curious, perhaps about the day's takings, and being a careful man, perhaps a suspicious man, he reaches out and lifts the pawl just to check, you understand? Just to be certain the mechanism is properly secured." Dr. Haydock's face had gone pale. "The penny would fly free, precisely, and the handle would spin backwards with considerable force. The flat wooden surface would strike anyone leaning over the well directly in the head, a heavy blow, as you yourself observed, and then the unfortunate victim would fall forward into the well." There was a long moment of silence. Somewhere across the green, a blackbird sang its morning song, oblivious to the grim reconstruction taking place. Slack cleared his throat. "You're saying this was deliberate, premeditated?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, carefully wrapping the penny in her handkerchief, "that this particular arrangement would not have occurred by accident. Someone filed that notch. Someone applied boot blacking to improve its grip. Someone positioned it precisely in the ratchet tooth and adjusted the windlass to create a trap." "A very clever trap, Inspector, disguised as an accident. But who?" Constable Polk burst out. "Who would know about windlass mechanisms and ratchets and such?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "That, Constable, is indeed the question we must answer, though I suspect that anyone who has lived in a village with a working well would have sufficient knowledge. These mechanisms are not complicated. They are simply domestic and therefore overlooked. Now, Inspector," she added, "I suggest we examine the well's interior rather carefully. I have a suspicion that we may find something else of interest, just below the mouth." She moved to the well's edge and peered down into the shadowy throat. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Just there, about 3 inches below the rim. Do you see that circular mark on the stone? A scuff, as though something metallic had briefly rested there and then been pulled away. I wonder what that might have been, and what purpose it served." Chapter 4, Echo Across the Green. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered at a discreet distance from the well, drawn by that irresistible curiosity that attends any unusual activity in a quiet village. Mrs. Price from the post office stood whispering with Miss Hartnell, while several children had abandoned their Saturday morning pursuits to watch the proceedings with wide eyes. Miss Marple had requested a small hand mirror from her bag and was now angling it carefully to catch the sunlight and direct it down into the well's throat. Inspector Slack, who had initially regarded this activity with barely concealed skepticism, found himself leaning forward with genuine interest. "There," Miss Marple said, adjusting the angle slightly. "Can you see it, Dr. Haydock?" "That circular mark I mentioned, just below the rim on the inner wall." The doctor squinted down. "By George, I can. Looks like something was hung there, then scraped away. The stones are lighter in a perfect circle, as though the surface had been abraded. Quite so. And now, gentlemen, I think we must turn our attention to the question of the sound young Tom heard. If you recall, he reported hearing a distinct ping, followed by a splash at 5:10. "But there's no ringer plate," Constable Polk objected. "Mr. Reeve took it down yesterday morning." "Exactly my point, Constable. No ringer plate, and yet a ping. Shall we conduct a small experiment?" From her capacious bag, Miss Marple produced a penny, not the notched one, which now resided carefully wrapped in her handkerchief, but an ordinary penny from her purse. "Mr. Reeve, would you tell us approximately how high the water level stands at present?" Jacob, who had been watching the proceedings with the air of a man witnessing the unraveling of his orderly world, cleared his throat. "About 16 feet down, Miss Marple. We've had good rain this summer. Water's higher than usual for late August. Thank you. Now observe carefully, please." Miss Marple held the penny at arm's length over the well's mouth and released it. The coin fell, tumbling in the shaft of sunlight, and disappeared into the darkness below. After a moment, there came a soft, dull sound. Not a splash exactly, but a plop, muffled and unremarkable. "You see," Miss Marple said, "with the water so high and no ringer plate to strike, a coin makes very little noise at all. Certainly not the clear ping that Tom described. The sound would be absorbed by the water, particularly at this time of year when there is no echo chamber between the water surface and where the ringer plate once hung." Slack frowned. So the boy was wrong about what he heard. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe Tom heard exactly what he said he heard. A ping, and then a splash. Two distinct sounds. The question is, what made the ping if not a coin striking the ringer plate?" She turned to face the little group, her eyes bright with that particular intelligence that always reminded Dr. Haydock of a bird observing something of interest. "I suggest that the ping came from something metallic striking the stone throat of the well, something that hung just inside the rim, approximately where we observe that circular scuff mark. Something that could be made to clink against the stone wall and produce exactly the sort of high, clear note that Tom heard." "But what?" Dr. Haydock asked. "And how would it get there?" "As to what, I cannot yet say with certainty, though I have my suspicions. As to how, that is rather more interesting. You see, if one wished to create a false impression of the time of death, one would need to produce evidence that Mr. Dilling was alive and dropping coins into the well at 5:10, when in fact he had died nearly 2 hours earlier. The ping young Tom heard was meant to simulate a coin being dropped. It was meant to place the time of death firmly at 5:10 rather than at 8:15. The implications hung in the air like the morning mist that was only now beginning to burn away. Lady Bantry, who had joined the crowd and pushed her way to the front with that aristocratic disregard for propriety that Miss Marple rather admired, spoke up. "But Jane, how could someone make a ping at 5:10 if they weren't standing here at the well? Surely they'd be seen." "An excellent question, Dolly. Perhaps not standing at the well itself, but nearby. Close enough to create the sound, but far enough away to avoid observation. The green is quite open, but there are places of concealment. The hedge behind the well, for instance." Jacob Reeves' face had gone from troubled to thoroughly alarmed. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that someone stood in the hedge at 5:10 and somehow made that noise?" "But how? And why would they be there at all if not for mischief?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, that someone may have arranged matters so that a metallic object hung just inside the well's mouth on a very fine thread or string. At the appointed time, this person pulled the thread from their place of concealment, causing the object to strike the stone and produce the ping. The object would then fall into the water, producing the splash. Simple, domestic, and very effective. Slack's expression had changed from skepticism to grim determination. "Right then, Constable Polk. I want that hedge behind the well examined inch by inch. Look for any sign of someone standing there. Broken twigs, footprints, anything at all. And check the vicarage chest for that ringer plate. I want to see it with my own eyes." "The ringer plate will be there, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "I have no doubt of that. What we must look for is something else. Something small and light that would make a good pinging sound. A small tin lid, perhaps, or a metal button, something that could be easily procured and would not be missed." She paused, watching as Constable Polk hurried off toward the hedge. "There is something else we must consider," she continued. "The person who arranged this elaborate deception must have known about the well's mechanism. They must have known that Tom Petta habitually cycled past at that time, for his grandmother insists he be home by 10. They must have known the habits of the village, the routines of the people. This was not the work of a stranger, gentlemen. This was done by someone who lives among us." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "Someone with access to bootblacking, a file, and time enough to prepare the trap. Someone who could move about the village without attracting attention." "Precisely. And someone who had a reason to wish Mr. Dilling dead, a reason strong enough to plan and execute a rather clever murder, and then to create an elaborate false trail to mislead the investigation." From the hedge, Constable Polk called out, his voice carried across the green with excitement. "Inspector! I found something. You'll want to see this." The group moved as one toward the hedge gap behind the well. There, caught on a thorny branch perhaps 4 feet from the ground, was a single white thread. It was fine, the sort used for delicate needlework, and it appeared to be under tension, as though it had been pulled tight and then broken or cut, and on a twig just beside it, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it, was a tiny dab of yellowish wax. Miss Marple smiled, though there was no pleasure in it. "There," she said softly, "is your proof, Inspector. Someone stood here at 5:10 last night and pulled a thread. The wax held it in place until the appointed moment. A very simple mechanism, really, but quite effective." Chapter 5. Ratchet Teeth with Blacking. The discovery of the thread had transformed Inspector Slack's approach to the investigation. Where before he had been inclined toward the comfortable conclusion of accidental death, he now displayed the tenacity of a terrier with a rat. By noon, he had established himself in the vicar's study and was conducting a series of interviews that had the entire village in a state of nervous speculation. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain, sat in the corner with her knitting. She had found over the years that people tended to speak more freely when she appeared to be occupied with something innocuous. The rhythmic click of her needles seemed to have a soothing effect, loosening tongues that might otherwise have remained guarded. Mr. Hart was the first to be called in. He entered with that easy confidence that marked him as a man accustomed to dealing with officials, though Miss Marple detected a certain weariness in his eyes. "Mr. Hart," Slack began without preamble, "I understand you describe yourself as a numismatist, a coin collector." "That's correct, Inspector. I've been collecting for some 20 years. It's more than a hobby, really. I've published several articles in the field. And yesterday afternoon you were helping Miss Pratt sort through coins from the well fund." "Hardly sorting, Inspector. Merely having a look. One never knows when something interesting might turn up. A rare mint mark, an unusual variety." The morning's collection had been placed in a box, and Miss Pratt was kind enough to let me examine them before they were counted properly. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. How thoughtful of her. And did you find anything of interest, Mr. Hart? Hart turned toward her, and his smile was benign. Nothing remarkable, I'm afraid, Miss Marple. Common pennies mostly, a few halfpennies. Nothing worth the trouble of notching, if that's what you're implying. The words hung in the air. Hart's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Slack leaned forward. And how would you know about the notched penny, Mr. Hart? That detail hasn't been made public, hasn't it? I suppose I must have heard someone mention it this morning. News travels quickly in a village. Hart's tone remained pleasant, but his fingers had tightened on the brim of the hat he held in his lap. I see. And can you tell me where you were at 5:10 last evening? On the 8:40 bus to Kingham, Inspector. I had a fellow collector to visit. Several people saw me board. Mrs. Pike sold me my ticket herself. Slack made a note. And this morning, Mr. Hart, early this morning before the investigation began, were you anywhere near the well? Not at all. I only returned on the first bus at 9:30. Went straight to my cottage. After Hart had been dismissed, Slack pulled out a small evidence bag. Inside was a pocket file, the sort used for fine metalwork. Found this in Hart's coat pocket, he said quietly. When I pressed it against the notched penny, the grooves matched perfectly. And smell it, Miss Marple. She did so delicately. The sharp tang of boot blacking was unmistakable. He claims he keeps it oiled to prevent rust, Slack said. Very convenient explanation. Perhaps too convenient, Miss Marple murmured. Though I think we must not be hasty, Inspector. A file that matches is circumstantial. Many people keep their tools oiled, and Mr. Hart was on the bus at the crucial time. That much can be verified easily enough. Ned Booker stomped in next, his heavy boots leaving marks on the vicar's carpet. He was a man who carried his resentments like a physical burden, shoulders hunched, face set in permanent displeasure. I've already told you, he said before Slack could speak. I was at the Hare and Hounds from 9 onward. Ask anyone. Bill Wright, Tom Spencer, half the village saw me there. And before 9, Mr. Booker? Home feeding my stock. I've got 12 head of cattle that need tending. Whatever else is happening in the world. You had words with Mr. Dilling about drawing water from the well. Booker's face darkened. I had words. He threatened to report me for taking what my father and his father took before him. Rights. That's what we're talking about. Ancient rights. Ancient enough to kill for? Don't be daft. I wanted to blacken his eye, not crack his skull. Besides, how would I get past the padlock? I haven't got a key, and I'm no lockpick. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Tell me, Mr. Booker, your hands. They're quite stained with something dark. Cold dust, perhaps. Booker held up his massive hands. The nails were indeed dark, almost black. Tar, Miss Marple, been treating fence posts. Messy work, but it needs doing, of course. And tar is quite different from boot blacking, isn't it? The smell, the texture, one wouldn't confuse them. After Booker had departed, still radiating injured pride, Slack pulled out another piece of evidence. The ratchet wheel had been removed from the windlass, and he now placed it on the vicar's desk. The brass gleamed in the afternoon light, except for one section where the teeth showed a dullness. Slack pointed to a particular tooth with his pencil. See here. This tooth has blacking worked into the base, and this one beside it shows burnishing, as though something metallic had been wedged against it with considerable force. Miss Marple examined it closely. The pattern is quite clear. Someone filed that penny, applied blacking to make it grip, and wedged it precisely here. They would have needed to understand the mechanism quite well. Not intimate knowledge, perhaps, but certainly familiarity with how a ratchet operates. Which brings us to Miss Pratt, Slack said. Schoolmistress, ran the well booth all day. Had access to the coins, including the opportunity to select one for notching. Would have had ample time to observe the windlass mechanism. And she showed Mr. Hart the morning's collection, Miss Marple added thoughtfully. I wonder why she needed those coins counted twice, once in the morning before the fete, and again in the evening with Mr. Hart's assistance. Slack consulted his notes. According to the ledger, the morning collection was $7, 4 shillings, and twopence. The evening count after the fete hasn't been completed yet. The boxes are evidence. I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that we should examine Miss Pratt's accounts very carefully, and perhaps we might also inquire about her handwriting. I seem to recall that she kept a neat list of the takings. Neat, but with certain entries that appear to have been written over, as though corrected. You think she was covering something up? I think, Miss Marple replied, that we should speak with Miss Pratt herself, and perhaps we might also ask to see her sewing basket. White thread is common enough, but paired with certain other items it becomes rather more significant. Slack nodded grimly. I'll have Constable Polk fetch her, and we'll want to see that ledger again. Fresh eyes and all. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was far from the scarf taking shape beneath her fingers. Somewhere in the tangle of coins and threads, ratchets and echoes, a pattern was emerging, not yet complete, but taking form like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. Soon, very soon, the picture would be clear. Chapter 6, 2 Keys. 1. Copy Miss Lily Pratt arrived at the vicarage looking composed, though Miss Marple observed a certain tension in the way her fingers gripped her handbag. She was dressed neatly in a gray suit that spoke of modest means carefully maintained, and her hair was arranged with the precision one might expect of someone who stood before a classroom of critical young eyes each day. Miss Pratt, Inspector Slack began, gesturing to the chair across from him. Thank you for coming. I have a few questions about yesterday's events. Of course, Inspector. Anything I can do to help? You managed the wishing well booth throughout the day, I understand. Yes, from 10 in the morning until we closed at 6. It was quite successful. The children enjoyed making their wishes, and we collected a good sum for the roof fund. And after the fete closed, what did you do? I packed away the booth materials and returned them to the school. Then I came back to ensure everything was in order at the well. Mr. Dilling arrived just as I was finishing. He asked about the placard, whether it was secure. I assured him it was and went on my way. What time was this? Shortly after 7, I should think. Perhaps 1:15. It was still light, but the sun was getting low. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And Mr. Hart? Miss Pratt, I understand he assisted you with counting the coins earlier in the day? Lily turned toward her, and for the first time a faint color rose in her cheeks. Mr. Hart is a collector. He offered to examine the morning's collection for anything unusual. It seemed harmless enough, and he was very knowledgeable. The morning's collection, Slack said, consulting the ledger before him. 7, 4 shillings, and twopence, a respectable sum. And yet I see here that certain entries appear to have been amended. He pointed to a line where the ink was slightly darker, as though the figures had been traced over. I sometimes make errors in my haste, Lily said, though her voice had become slightly brittle. It's important that the accounts be accurate. I correct them when needed, of course. And the handwriting in these corrections, it seems somewhat different, straighter, perhaps more deliberate, than your usual script. I write more carefully when making corrections. One must be certain. Slack nodded slowly. Miss Pratt, do you have a key to the well's padlock? Certainly not. Only Mr. Reeve and Mr. Dilling had keys. It's always been that way. And yet Mr. Reeve mentioned something interesting to Constable Polk this morning. Apparently some months ago you took a rubbing of Mr. Dilling's key in graphite. He said something about ordering a spare. For the first time, Lily's composure wavered. That was for the church committee. We discussed having additional keys made in case of emergency. Mr. Dilling was often difficult about lending his. The rubbing was never used. He decided against it. I see. And where is that rubbing now? I have no idea. Discarded, I should think. It was months ago. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. How curious. You see, Mrs. Reeve found something rather interesting in her work basket this very morning, a scrap of paper with a key bow rubbing on it, and a smear of boot blacking. She's been mending Mr. Reeve's waistcoat, you understand? And the paper was tucked inside the pocket. She brought it to my attention because she thought it odd. The color had drained from Lily's face. I don't see what that has to do with me. Mrs. Reeve mends for several households, Miss Marple continued gently. Including yours, I believe. She mentioned collecting a basket of items from you just last week. A blouse with a torn cuff, and a skirt that needed hemming. Slack leaned forward. Miss Pratt, did you make a copy of Mr. Dilling's key? I did no such thing. Then you won't mind if we examine your cottage. Look for a key that matches the padlock. Lily's hands twisted in her lap. You have no right. I have every right in a murder investigation. And make no mistake, Miss Pratt, this is murder. Someone wedged that ratchet. Someone created a false timeline with a thread and a bit of metal. Someone who knew the village routines, who understood the well's mechanism, and who had both opportunity and means. And motive, Miss Marple added softly. That's perhaps the most important question, isn't it? Why would someone wish Mr. Dilling dead? Lily looked at her sharply. If someone did wish him dead, they'd have good reason. He was a thief, Miss Marple. Oh, nothing so crude as breaking into houses. He skimmed from the church funds, rounded his expenses to the nearest shilling when the actual amounts were pence, claimed travel costs that were never incurred. I documented it all, though no one would listen. You kept records for months, every suspicious entry, every inflated claim. I brought it to the committee, but they said I was being overly suspicious. Mr. Dilling had been treasurer for 15 years. Who was I? They implied I should question his integrity. Her voice had risen, passion breaking through the careful control. And Mr. Hart? Miss Marple asked. What was his role in all this? Lily's mouth set in a thin line. She said nothing. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested. Mr. Hart was also helping himself, sorting through the coins, selecting the better ones, old pennies, unusual mint marks worth more to a collector than their face value. Was that what you discovered, Miss Pratt? That both men were stealing from the children's wishes? Tears had begun to track down Lily's cheeks, though her voice remained steady. He laughed at me. Mr. Dilling laughed when I confronted him, said I should mind my sums and leave the accounting to those who understood it, as though I were a child to be patted on the head and dismissed. Slack stood abruptly. Constable Polk, I want Miss Pratt's cottage searched. Look for a key, any tools that might have been used to file metal, and anything that might have held boot blacking. Also, see if there's a small tin lid missing from anywhere, the sort used for paint pots. As Polk hurried out, Lily sat very still. I loved that school, she said quietly. Every penny we raised went toward giving those children something better, a sound roof, proper books, heat in winter. And men like Dilling stole from them without a second thought. Stole from children who came to school in worn shoes and mended clothes. So you decided to teach him a lesson, Slack said grimly. Lily looked up at him, her eyes dry now, and in them Miss Marple saw something she had observed before in murderers. Not remorse precisely, but a terrible certainty of righteousness. I decided, Lily said, that if the church committee wouldn't act, someone had to. Chapter 7. The Bucket Rope. Too Dry. Dr. Haydock had remained silent throughout the interview with Miss Pratt, but now he rose from his chair with a troubled expression. He was a man who dealt in physical evidence, the tangible facts of death and injury, and he seemed uncomfortable with the emotional territory they had just traversed. "Inspector," he said quietly, "before we proceed further, there are certain medical observations that bear revisiting. If you'll permit me." Slack nodded curtly. "Go ahead, doctor." "When I examined Mr. Dilling's body last evening, I noted that the rope gripping his shoulder was dry. Not damp, not wet, but thoroughly dry. This struck me as peculiar at the time, but in the confusion I didn't pursue it." Miss Marple looked up with interest. "Dry, you say? Even though he was partially submerged in the well?" "Precisely. If the bucket and rope had been running normally, if he had been hauling up the mechanism, or if the drum had been spinning as he fell, the rope would have been wet from contact with the water. Instead, it was dry where it held him. Only the portions that had been submerged after he fell were actually wet." "And the bucket itself," Miss Marple inquired, "clean of any fresh slime or weed?" "The well walls are naturally somewhat slimy below the waterline, as one would expect. Yet the bucket rim showed no recent transfer of such material. It was as though the bucket had been sitting still, not moving up and down through the water." Slack frowned. "What are you suggesting, doctor?" "I'm suggesting that the rope and bucket were stationary when Dilling fell. They hadn't been hauled up recently. The mechanism wasn't in active use, which aligns perfectly with Miss Marple's theory of the wedged penny. A single violent release of the handle, not a steady operation of the windlass." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And there was another detail, was there not? A dent on the windlass handle itself?" "Indeed, fresh damage where the wood met the iron cheek of the drum mount, consistent with the handle, being released under tension and striking the metal with considerable force, the sort of impact that would only occur if the drum had been wound past its balance point and then suddenly released." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "Gentlemen, Miss Marple, this was a carefully constructed trap. The dry rope proves it wasn't an accident during normal operation. The clean bucket proves the drum hadn't been running, and the dent on the handle proves the violence of the release." Inspector Slack had been making notes, but now he set down his pencil. "Mr. Reeve, you said you locked the well at 7. When did you last actually use the windlass?" "When was the bucket last drawn up?" Jacob Reeve, who had been summoned back to the vicarage, shifted uncomfortably. "Not since 6, sir. After the fete closed, I drew up the bucket to check the rope was sound and the mechanism working proper. Then I lowered it again, locked the lid, and went home for my tea." "And the rope was dry then, when you locked up?" "I mostly wiped down the handle and the drum as I always do. Keeps the wood from rotting. The rope dries quick enough in August weather." Miss Marple's needles had resumed their steady rhythm. "So between 6, when Mr. Reeve left it secure, and 8:15 when Mr. Dilling died, someone must have accessed the well. Someone with a key or a copy of one. They wound the drum until the bucket weight was barely held by the ratchet, then wedged that notched penny to hold it in place." "A death trap," Dr. Haydock said grimly. "Set and waiting. But requiring the victim to do one specific thing," Miss Marple added. "He had to lift the pawle. Why would Mr. Dilling do that? What would make him reach for the pawle mechanism?" There was a moment of silence. Then Jacob spoke hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but anyone who wanted to peek down into the well proper would need to lift the pawle to release the bucket a bit. The lid covers most of the opening. If you wanted to look straight down past the bucket, you'd need to lower it a few inches. Natural thing to do, really, if you were curious about something down there, or suspicious about something," Miss Marple suggested. "If Mr. Dilling thought someone might have tampered with the coins, he might want to inspect the bucket itself, see if anyone had tried to fish out the takings." Slack stood and began pacing. "So our murderer sets the trap knowing Dilling's nature? Knowing he'll come back, knowing he'll be suspicious, knowing he'll lift that pawle to check. It's diabolical." "It's methodical," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Someone studied the mechanism, practiced. Perhaps someone who understood not just how the windlass worked, but how Mr. Dilling thought, what he would do when confronted with the locked well and his own suspicious mind. Constable Polk appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Inspector, we've searched Miss Pratt's cottage. Found a small file in her desk drawer. Matches the marks on that penny, and there's boot blacking in her cleaning cupboard." "Half the village has boot blacking," Slack said impatiently. "What else?" "A tin of poster paint in her schoolroom, sir. Watercolor type. One of the lids is missing. And there's a spool of white thread in her sewing basket." "Also common enough," Slack muttered, though his expression suggested the accumulation of evidence was telling its own story. "There's one more thing, sir, in her desk, tucked inside a prayer book. A list of dates and amounts. Looks like she was tracking Mr. Dilling's expense claims, going back months. Meticulous records all in her hand, and at the bottom, underlined twice, for the children he stole from. The phrase hung in the air like an indictment, or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, like a justification. "She hasn't confessed to murder," Slack said, "just to documenting Dilling's thefts and confronting him about them. That's not enough to charge her." "Then we must reconstruct the crime completely," Miss Marple said. "Every step, every piece of evidence. The dry rope tells us the trap was set without testing it. The dent on the handle tells us the force of the release. The boot blacking on the penny and Powell tells us someone prepared carefully. And the white thread tells us someone created that false echo at 10 past. 5 to mislead our investigation." She set down her knitting and looked at Inspector, Slack with those mild blue eyes that had seen through so many deceits over the years. "There is one element we haven't fully explored, Inspector. The thread itself. It was under tension, you said, when Constable Polk found it. That means it was pulled taut at some point and then either broke or was cut. If Miss Pratt pulled that thread at 10 past 5 to create the false echo, where was she standing? What was her stated alibi for that time?" Slack consulted his notes. "She claims she was at the schoolroom until 9, then walked home by way of the green. Several people saw her leave the school, but no one specifically noticed her between 9:30 and 10. A walk across the green would take her directly past the well," Miss Marple observed, "and past the hedge where the thread was anchored. A momentary pause, a quick pull in the darkness, and the deed is done. The tin lid would clink against the stone, fall into the water, and young Tom on his bicycle would hear exactly what he reported, ping and splash." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "And a small pebble tossed in afterward would account for the secondary splash, if needed. Simple, effective, and requiring no special equipment beyond what any schoolmistress would have to hand." "We need a confession," Slack said flatly. "Or we need to place her at that hedge at 10 past 5 with certainty. Circumstantial evidence won't satisfy a jury, not for a woman of her standing and reputation." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "Then perhaps we should consider what other evidence might exist. The tin lid, for instance. It fell into the well. Could it be recovered? And might it bear some mark that identifies it as coming from Miss Pratt's schoolroom?" "Worth trying," Slack agreed. "Polk, get someone to drag the well. Look for a small tin lid, probably from a paint pot, and check what brands the school uses." As Polk departed once more, Miss Marple gazed out the window toward where the well stood on the green, innocent now in the afternoon sunlight. Somewhere in this tangle of threads and coins, ratchets and echoes, lay the complete truth. And truth, she had long ago learned, had a way of emerging, no matter how cleverly it was hidden. Chapter 8. A White Thread in the Hedge. The afternoon shadows were lengthening by the time Miss Marple suggested they return to the hedge behind the well. Inspector Slack had been inclined to wait for the results of the well-dragging operation. but something in her manner persuaded him that there might be further discoveries to be made. "You see, Inspector," she said as they walked across the green, "a thread does not simply appear in a hedge of its own accord. Someone placed it there with deliberate purpose. And if one is going to arrange something as precise as a false echo, one must test it first. One must be certain the mechanism will work. You think the murderer practiced? I think anyone with sense would imagine going to all that trouble to set the trap, only to have the thread break or the sound fail to carry. No, whoever did this would have wanted certainty." They reached the gap in the hedge where Constable Polk had made his discovery. The white thread still hung from the thorny branch. Though it had now been marked with a small flag for evidence, Miss Marple produced a magnifying glass from her capacious bag and examined the thread closely. "Fine cotton," she murmured, "the sort used for delicate needlework or hemming. And see here where it's caught on the thorn. The end is quite frayed, as though it snapped under tension rather than being cut." She moved along the hedge, peering through the branches toward the well. From this vantage point, one had a clear view of the well's mouth, though the hedge itself provided excellent concealment from anyone standing on the green. "The angle would be perfect," she observed. "Stand just here in this gap, and you could thread a line through to the well without being seen from the cottages. At night, with no moon, you'd be quite invisible." Dr. Haydock had accompanied them, and he now crouched to examine the ground. "Someone stood here, certainly. The grass is pressed down, and there's a scuff mark in the dirt. Small shoe, I'd say, woman's size. Or a man with small feet," Slack said, though without conviction. Miss Marple had found the twig with the dab of wax. She touched it carefully with one gloved finger. "Beeswax, I should think. The sort one uses for thread when sewing leather, or for waterproofing. It would hold the thread in place admirably. Fix it to the twig at the proper height, run the line through the hedge to the well, and there you have your mechanism. A simple pull at the appointed time, and your false evidence is created." She straightened, brushing a leaf from her skirt. "But there's something else we must consider. This thread ran from here to the well, a distance of perhaps 20 feet. That's a considerable length, and it would need to be attached to something at the other end, something that would hang just inside the well's mouth and strike the stone when pulled." "The tin lid," Slack said. "Has to be? Indeed. But how is it suspended? A thread alone wouldn't be rigid enough to position a tin lid precisely. There would need to be some way to keep it hanging at just the right depth, just the right angle." Miss Marple moved toward the well, the two men following. She knelt carefully at the edge and examined the stone throat once more. The circular scuff mark is still visible, a pale ring against the darker stone. "Here, do you see? Not just a scuff, but several small indentations around the circle, as though something with a rough edge rested here and then scraped away when pulled." "The rim of the tin lid," Dr. Haydock suggested. "Possibly. But there's more. Look at these tiny marks here and here. They're very faint, but they suggest that something was wedged against the stone, not simply resting, but held in place with some tension." She sat back on her heels, thinking. The thread alone couldn't do that. But if the tin lid were bent slightly, curved to grip the stone edge, and the thread passed through a hole in its center, then pulling the thread would both free it and cause it to strike the stone as it fell. The curved edge would create that distinctive ping against the masonry. "Clever," Slack admitted grudgingly. "Devilishly clever. Not devilish, Inspector, merely domestic. These are all household items, things any woman would have to hand. A tin lid from a paint pot, cotton thread from a sewing basket, a dab of beeswax, and the knowledge of how sound carries across a village green at night." They were interrupted by Constable Polk, who came hurrying across the green with something wrapped in his handkerchief. "Found it, sir," he announced breathlessly. "Took a bit of doing, but we dragged it up from the bottom. Small tin lid, just like Miss Marple said. He unwrapped it carefully. The lid was perhaps 2 inches across, made of tin-plated steel, and its rim showed unmistakable bruising where it had struck stone. More significantly, there was a small hole punched through its center, and the metal around the rim had been bent into a shallow curve. "Poster paint," Polk added. The label still partly stuck to it. Brand name Winsor & Newton, color cobalt blue. And does the school use Winsor & Newton paints? They do indeed, Miss Marple. Got a whole shelf of them in the art cupboard. And there's a tin of cobalt blue with its lid missing. Slack took the tin lid and examined it closely. The evidence was damning in its simplicity. Thread hole, bent rim, the right size to produce a clear ringing tone against stone, and from Miss Pratt's own schoolroom. "We'll need to question her again," he said. "This puts her at the scene, no question. But I want to understand the complete picture first. Miss Marple, walk me through it." "Every step." Miss Marple rose, accepting Dr. Haydock's offered hand. She stood for a moment, gazing across the green toward the school building, its windows golden in the late afternoon sun. "Very well," she said quietly. "Let us suppose that Miss Pratt, having discovered Mr. Dilling's thefts and having been rebuffed when she reported them, decided to take matters into her own hands. She's an intelligent woman, methodical, accustomed to planning lessons and managing children. She would approach this as she would any problem requiring a solution." They began walking slowly toward the school. Through the windows, they could see the neat rows of desks, the alphabet chart on the wall, the art supplies on their shelves. First, she makes a copy of the key. She already has a graphite rubbing from months ago. Perhaps she takes it to a locksmith in another village, claiming she's lost her key. Or perhaps she files one herself. Schoolmistresses often have access to simple tools, metal files for sharpening compasses, that sort of thing. They reached the school. Next, she studies the windlass mechanism. Jacob Reeve is proud of that well. He would happily explain its workings to anyone who asked. She learns about the ratchet, the pawel, how the tension is maintained. She selects a penny from the morning's collection, files a notch in it, applies boot blacking to make it grip. She tests it, perhaps when no one is watching, makes certain it will hold. Miss Marple paused at the school's entrance. Then comes the cleverer part. She knows that Dr. Haydock will estimate the time of death. She needs to create doubt, to suggest that Mr. Dilling was alive much later than he actually was. She thinks of young Tom Petta, who cycles past at 10 each night. She thinks of the old ringer plate removed for safety. She thinks of how sound carries, and she creates her false echo. Slack finished. Precisely. On the evening of the fit, after everything is closed, she goes to the well with her copied key. She sets the trap with the wedged penny. She arranges her thread from the hedge to the well, with the bent tin lid positioned to create that distinctive ping. Then she goes to the schoolroom, establishes that she's there, and later walks home across the green. At 5:10, she pauses at the hedge, pulls the thread, and creates the sound that Tom hears. Simple, effective, and devastatingly clever. Dr. Haydock shook his head slowly. All for the children, she taught. All because Dilling stole from the roof fund? All because, Miss Marple corrected gently, she placed her own judgment above the law. That is always dangerous. Doctor, no matter how righteous the cause. Chapter 9. Alibis by Lamplight. Evening had settled over St. Mary Me. By the time Inspector Slack reconvened his inquiry at the vicarage, the lamps had been lit, casting pools of warm light in the study, while the windows reflected back the darkness outside. It was the sort of scene that might have been cozy under other circumstances, but tonight there was a tension in the air that no amount of lamplight could dispel. Miss Marple had taken her customary seat in the corner, though her knitting lay untouched in her lap. She had the look of someone waiting for a denouement. though whether she anticipated satisfaction or sorrow was difficult to say. Inspector Slack had arranged to speak with each of the principals once more, this time with the benefit of the physical evidence now assembled on the vicar's desk. The notched penny in its evidence bag, the tin lid with its telltale hole and bent rim, the spool of white thread from Miss Pratt's sewing basket, a sample of boot blacking from her cleaning cupboard, and the file from her desk drawer, its grooves matching perfectly the notch in the penny. Jacob Reeve was called in first, looking haggard and older than his years. The events had shaken him profoundly, and he twisted his cap between his calloused hands. "Mr. Reeve," Slack began not unkindly, "I need to verify your movements on the evening of the fête. You say you locked the well at 7? "I did, sir, just as I've done every year. Locked it proper and went home to Martha." "And you remained at home from that time until you were called to the green at 25 minutes past 8? "That's right, sir." We had our tea, listened to the wireless. The BBC News was on, like always. "What time does the news begin?" 8 o'clock, sir." "We never miss it." Miss Marple looked up. "And you heard the cry at 8:15, Mr. Reeve, while the news was still broadcasting?" Jacob hesitated. "Well, now you mention it, Miss Marple. It might have been just after the news had finished, I think. Martha was clearing the tea things. That would put it closer to past, wouldn't it?" "It would indeed. So you have a solid alibi for the time of death, witnessed by your wife and corroborated by the BBC schedule." "Thank you, Mr. Reeve." After Jacob had been dismissed, looking relieved, Ned Booker was shown in. He carried with him the faint smell of tar and hay, and his expression suggested he considered this entire proceeding a waste of his valuable time. "Mr. Booker," Slack said, "you stated you were at the Hare and Hounds from 9 onward. Can anyone verify this? Half the village was there, weren't they? Bill Wright, Tom Spencer, old Davies from the mill. We were playing darts until closing time. You can ask any of them. And before 9, home, like I said, tending my stock. The cattle don't care about murder investigations, do they? They need feeding regardless. Was anyone with you to confirm this?" Booker's face darkened. "I live alone, Inspector. Have done since my mother passed. But if you're suggesting I had anything to do with Dilling's death, you're barking up the wrong tree. I may have wished the man ill, but wishing and doing are different matters." Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mr. Booker, when you draw water from the well for your cattle, do you ever adjust the windlass mechanism, lift the pawl to control the descent?" "Of course I do. Any fool knows how to work a windlass, but I haven't drawn from that well in weeks. Not since Dilling threatened to report me. Been using the trough at Meadow Farm instead. Old Jenkins don't mind, long as I help with the hay come harvest time." After Booker had departed, still radiating indignation, Slack made a note. "His alibi solid for 9 onward, but before that he's alone. Still, without a key to the padlock, he couldn't have set the trap. Unless he forced the lock," Dr. Haydock suggested. "No sign of that. The mechanism was intact, opened with a key. Which brings us to our other key holder." Miss Lily Pratt entered with her head held high, though her face was pale in the lamplight. She had changed from her gray suit into a dark dress that seemed almost mourning in its severity. She sat without being asked, her hands folded primly in her lap. "Miss Pratt," Slack began, his tone formal, "we have assembled certain evidence that requires explanation. This tin lid was recovered from the well. It matches a missing lid from your schoolroom. This thread matches thread from your sewing basket. This file was found in your desk, and its grooves match the notch in this penny. What do you have to say?" Lily looked at each item in turn, her expression unchanging. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I have already told you that I documented Mr. Dilling's thefts. I have told you that I confronted him about them. I have not, however, confessed to murder." "Then explain these items." "The tin lid could have been taken by any of the children. They're forever borrowing things for their projects. The thread is ordinary cotton available in any shop. The file is a standard tool that I use for sharpening compass points. And the penny, well, anyone might have filed a notch in a penny for any number of reasons. And the boot blacking found in your cleaning cupboard? I clean my own boots, Inspector. Is that now evidence of murder? Miss Marple set aside her knitting and leaned forward slightly. Miss Pratt, could you tell us where you were at 5:10 last evening? You mentioned walking home from the school. Did you pass by the well? For the first time, Lily's composure wavered. I may have. The path across the green is the most direct route to my cottage. Did you pause at all during your walk? I don't recall. It was dark, and I was tired after a long day. You see, Miss Marple said gently, young Tom Petta heard a very distinctive sound at 5:10. A ping followed by a splash. We have established that this sound could not have come from a coin dropped naturally into the well. It required some mechanism, some deliberate arrangement. The bent tin lid found at the bottom of the well would produce exactly such a sound if pulled against the stone throat and then released. Lily's hands tightened in her lap, but she said nothing. The thread we found in the hedge, Miss Marple continued, had been under tension. It snapped when pulled, leaving the frayed end. We discovered. Someone stood in that hedge at 5:10 and pulled a thread that ran to the well, causing the tin lid to strike the stone and fall. That someone created a false echo to mislead the investigation, to suggest that Mr. Dilling was alive at 5:10 when, in fact, he had died 2 hours earlier. Can you prove it was me? Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. We can prove the tin lid came from your school. We can prove you had the tools and materials necessary. We can prove you had motive and opportunity. We can prove you made a copy of the key. What we cannot prove, unless you tell us, is exactly when you set the trap and exactly where you were at 5:10 last evening. There was a long silence. Outside, an owl called across the green, its voice lonely in the darkness. Finally, Lily spoke. I was at the hedge. I pulled the thread. I created the echo. Her voice was flat, emotionless. But I didn't set out to kill him. I wanted to frighten him, to make him think someone was watching. I thought if he believed someone knew about his thefts, he might stop. You're saying the wedged penny was an accident? I'm saying I don't know what happened. Perhaps I wound the drum too tight. Perhaps the penny slipped. I only meant to create a sound that would alarm him when he came to check the well. I didn't intend for the handle to strike him. Miss Marple's expression was infinitely sad. But you knew what a windlass under tension would do, Miss Pratt. You knew how a ratchet works, and you knew what would happen when Mr. Dilling lifted that pawl. Chapter 10. Well, coin wedge, false echo, and a windlass bite. The morning sun was well up by the time they gathered at the well for the final demonstration. Inspector Slack had insisted on reconstructing the crime in full, and Miss Marple had agreed that it was necessary, both for the prosecution and for the understanding of all concerned. The village had been kept at a respectful distance, though faces watched from cottage windows, and a few brave souls lingered at the edge of the green. Miss Lily Pratt stood between two constables, her face composed but colorless. She had spent the night in custody, and the strain showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. Yet there remained about her that quality of rigid dignity that had marked her throughout, the bearing of someone who believed, however mistakenly, that righteousness justified her actions. Miss Marple stood by the well with Dr. Haydock, while Inspector Slack positioned himself where he could observe both the mechanism and the accused. Jacob Reeve had been asked to assist with the demonstration, though the poor man looked as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. We shall proceed step by step, Slack announced, his voice carrying across the green. Miss Marple, if you would be good enough to explain the method as we demonstrate it, Miss Marple inclined her head. She looked, as always, like a gentle elderly lady concerned with nothing more troubling than her knitting. Yet those who knew her recognized the sharp intelligence behind those mild blue eyes. "The murder," she began quietly, "was accomplished through two distinct mechanisms working in concert. The first was mechanical and violent. The second was psychological and subtle. Together they created what appeared to be a simple accident, but was in fact a carefully planned execution." She moved to the windlass, where Jacob had already removed the padlock and raised the lid. The mechanical method employed the windlass itself as the weapon. "Mr. Reeve, would you demonstrate how the drum operates normally?" Jacob, his hand shaking slightly, turned the handle. The drum rotated smoothly, the rope coiling as the bucket rose. When he released the handle, the powel dropped into the ratchet teeth with a solid click, holding the drum secure. "Now observe what happens when we wind the drum one notch past its natural balance point." Miss Marple produced the notched penny, now returned from evidence. "The bucket's weight wants to pull the drum backward, but the powel prevents it. If we now wedge this penny into the ratchet tooth, coating it first with boot blacking for additional grip, we create a mechanism under considerable tension." Jacob, following her instructions with obvious reluctance, positioned the penny carefully. The drum remained fixed, but the tension in the rope was visible. "The trap is now set," Miss Marple continued. "Anyone who approaches the well and lifts the pawl, thinking to lower the bucket or inspect the mechanism, will release that tension instantly. The penny will fly free. The drum will spin backward with tremendous force, and the wooden handle will describe a lethal arc." She stepped back and nodded to Jacob, who carefully lifted the pawl. The effect was dramatic, even without a victim. The penny shot free with a sharp ping. The drum spun violently backward, and the handle whipped around in a blur before Jacob caught it, his face white. "The flat surface of the handle," Dr. Haydock said grimly, "would strike anyone leaning over the well squarely in the head. Death would not be instantaneous, but the victim would be stunned, disoriented. He would fall forward into the well, where the combination of injury and water would complete what the handle began." Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Dilling died, as Dr. Haydock originally estimated, at approximately 8:15. The evidence supports this. The dry rope, which would have been wet had the drum been operating normally. The clean bucket rim showing no recent passage through the water. The fresh dent on the handle where it struck the iron cheek of the drum mount. All speak to a single violent release, not an accident during normal operation." She paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust after a storm. But the murderer faced a problem. Dr. Haydock would examine the body and estimate the time of death. Without some compelling evidence to contradict his findings, the investigation would focus on who had access to the well between 7, when Mr. Reeve locked it, and 8:15, when Mr. Dilling died. That window was too narrow, too revealing. Inspector Slack took up the narrative. So the murderer created a false timeline, made it appear that Dilling was alive and dropping coins at 5:10, 2 hours after his actual death. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "This required the second mechanism, equally clever in its way. Young Tom Petta had to hear something at 5:10 that would convince him Mr. Dilling was alive. The murderer knew Tom's habits, knew he cycled past the well at precisely that time each night. She knew the old ringer plate had been removed, so a real coin would make no distinctive sound. She needed to create an artificial echo. She walked to the hedge gap, the group following. The method was simple but effective. A fine white thread was fixed here with beeswax. It ran through the hedge to the well, where a small tin lid, bent to grip the stone throat, hung just inside the opening. At the appointed time, standing concealed in this gap, the murderer pulled the thread. The tin lid struck the stone with a clear ping, then fell into the water with a splash. Tom heard exactly what he reported hearing, but it was not a coin being dropped by Amos Dilling. It was a tin lid being pulled by Lily Pratt. Lily stood very still, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the green. When she spoke, her voice was steady but utterly weary. He laughed at me. When I showed him the evidence of his thefts, when I told him I would report it to the diocesan authorities if the committee wouldn't act, he laughed. He said no one would believe a spinster schoolmistress over a man who had served the parish for 15 years. He said I should go back to teaching. My little brats their sums and leave the finances to those who understood them. She turned to face them. Fully for the first time, he was stealing from children, from their education, from their future, and he felt no shame. So yes, I studied the windlass. I made a copy of his key. I filed that penny and set that trap, and I stood in the hedge at 5:10 and pulled my thread to create doubt about when he died. You planned his murder, Slack said flatly. I planned to stop a thief. If he died in the process, it was because he came back to steal again, to check that no one had tampered with his takings. His own greed killed him. Inspector, I merely provided the mechanism. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. No, Miss Pratt, you provided intent, planning and execution. The law makes no distinction between a trap and a direct blow. You took a life, however much you believed you were serving justice. Jacob Reeve, who had been silent throughout, crossed himself and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. The children loved her. She gave them everything. And now, Sergeant Slack, said the inspector, take Miss Pratt to the car. As Lily was led away, her head still high, Lady Bantry moved to stand beside Miss Marple. They watched the small procession cross the green toward the waiting police vehicle. It seems so cruel, Jane, Dolly said quietly. She did it for the children. Dilling was a thief. Yes, he was. And perhaps if she had persisted, if she had taken her evidence to the proper authorities with patience and determination, justice would have been served through proper channels. But she chose to become judge, jury, and executioner. That is the tragedy, my dear. Not that Dilling died, but that Lily Pratt believed she had the right to kill him. She turned to look at the well, innocent now in the morning sunshine, its garland still draped around the stonework. Pennies, echoes, little threads, she murmured, echoing her earlier words. Such domestic things so easily overlooked, yet they tell the truth when people will not. The notched penny wedged in the ratchet, holding death in suspension. The false echo creating a lie about time. The white thread connecting hedge to well. Innocence to guilt. Dr. Haydock joined them, looking troubled. Will she hang? Do you think? That will be for the court to decide. There may be mitigation in her motive, though not in her method. She planned it carefully, executed it precisely, and created an elaborate deception to conceal her crime. Those are not the actions of someone acting in the heat of passion. They stood in silence for a moment. The village was beginning to stir again, life returning to normal as it always did, even after death and revelation. Somewhere a church bell chimed the hour, and birds sang in the hedge as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Come. Dolly, Miss Marple said at last, taking her friend's arm. Let us go home. There is nothing more to be done here. The truth has been told, and justice must take its course. One can only hope that in her prison cell, Miss Pratt will come to understand that good intentions do not justify evil deeds, and that no cause, however righteous, permits us to take another human life. They walked slowly across the green, two elderly ladies in the morning sun, leaving behind the well and its secrets.